I saw that you did a home birth.
Oof. Yeah. It was controversial one too.
It always is.
It always is.
But yours was particular because he was breech,
Yeah, he was
right?
breech.
So in North Carolina, that's not legal. They would make like a midwife would lose her ability.
License.
Yeah, she would have to.
It's like that in pretty much all the states.
Oh, I
actually.
didn't know
in
that.
Most states.
So
it
I
is.
guess starting there, why is it illegal to do a breech baby?
Okay, so breech became, what's crazy is my grandmother had my dad breech vaginally, which is pretty, again, it was more common back then than it is now, still pretty uncommon. Only 3 to 4% of all births ever actually end up with the baby coming out breech, because most of the time the babies will flip during labor and they'll come out head first. So it's a very, very like rare occurrence per se. But what I like is there's this organization called Breech Without Borders, and they teach, like, they're starting to teach physicians and a lot of midwives, like, the proper practices of natural breech delivery. So in 2001, the hospital, I would say like maybe the medical curriculum basically stopped teaching vaginal breech, and it only became C-section. And prior to a C-section, most mothers would be given the option to do an ECV, which is an external cephalic version. So that was pretty much gold standard 2001 on. If you ask a medical resident in like school today, they have never seen a vaginal breech delivery most times. And if they have a vaginal breech delivery by some very off chance in the hospital, they will call all of the doctors and all of the residents in to watch. In fact, the last woman that I think I had talked with had a breech birth kind of unexpected in the hospital, and they had 11 doctors and medical residents watching the birth.
Whoa.
That's how like taboo it is.
So why? Like, what is the foundation of this fear and concern?
It honestly came from a study that was done and I can't remember the exact study, but they later kind of redacted that the study wasn't entirely correct and didn't actually portray like what the real statistics of a breech birth were. And so this breech birth like basically showed like poorer outcomes versus doing it C-section. But the way that the trial or like the way that the study was set up, it didn't really grasp long-term effects on like cesareans versus like vaginal. It missed a lot of things. And like I said, I don't have the study like up, and I wish I did, but it was all based on this one study. And then later on they were like, well, this study was actually not even the most conclusive study. Like there's still more that could have been unpacked here. And so a lot of like doctors like raised red flags. But by that point, the medical curriculum based on the study had already changed. So 2001, they stopped doing it. Only C-sections are allowed with the option of like an ECV offered prior to an external cephalic version. And that is when they manually turn the baby, and it can be very traumatic. Some women end up going into labor because of it, and sometimes they'll even get epidurals while they're doing it.
Yeah, I've heard of
So
those.
it's pretty intense. It can be. Now, some midwives are trained to do it in a like manually in a very like gentle way. So some midwives do have that training and are actually able to do it in a way that is not necessarily considered invasive. And sometimes the baby takes it, or sometimes you'll go in for an ECV and the baby will flip right back. So I was at a birth center. I was 36 weeks pregnant, and homeboy was still breech. And I was like, oh boy. And they dropped me because the birth centers are not allowed to legally deliver breech, because since 2001, basically it stopped becoming a thing, and C-sections were the way to go. So they offered, like, they're like, hey, like there's only 2 doctors that we know in the area that would potentially let you trial vaginal breech. But even still, they still have pretty like high rates of C-sections. They still intervene here and there, or you can also schedule an ECV. So I was left with like basically little to no options. And I was like, this doesn't feel right. I know that I can deliver this baby like vaginally. And my really good friend had also had a breech birth. Home birth.
Wow.
And I called her up and I was like, hey, like, can you talk to me about like what happened? Like, give me what like happened. She's like, oh, well, I had like this one special midwife from Tennessee, and she's very highly trained, and she teaches other people like a lot of like breech. And why breech is so dangerous, quote unquote, like getting back to your question, is because there is this risk of the neck.
Okay.
So the difference between a baby that's coming out head first is that the head and the neck are born first, versus a baby that's coming out breech. A lot of times it gets to the neck and it's hanging. And if anybody tries to get the rest of the head, neck out and try to maneuver the baby, they can break the neck.
Whoa. Okay.
So it sounds, and again, sounds a lot scarier than it actually is, because if you learn more and more about breech, you realize that in some ways breech birth is actually easier, especially if you're doing it in a pool, which is what I did. So breech birth is just a variation of normal. And that's what Breech Without Borders, the organization, teaches. And now they're teaching a lot of physicians and midwives and stuff how to do it properly. And it's pretty international. So it's gained a lot of traction, and there's more people that are willing to hear, but it's still very, very taboo. The rule with a breech baby is you never touch the breech baby when it is coming out. As a midwife, you let it come out its own.
Okay.
You let it hang. Basically, like, it comes out feet first. You don't do interventions to get it out. And if you
can they hold you open while it's happening?
they can help hold you open. Yeah, exactly. There's certain things that aren't as much of a concern. Now, there's like a couple of different types of breech positions that are trickier than others, right? But Luca came out textbook breech, which is his butt rumped first and then his feet came out, and then the rest of him like kind of came out after. And like I said, he was in a pool, so it was a very smooth process, and nobody touched him.
It takes the gravity away a
Basically,
little bit.
it just takes the gravity away. He was kind of just like floating. He was floating for a second, and then he came out. And you don't have to worry about things like shoulder dystocia and like some of the other things
in the water
that you might have to worry about. Yeah, that you might have to worry about with like head down babies, where the positioning, sometimes the shoulders come out one way.
That's how my
right?
second came out.
Yeah, exactly.
Shoulder first, and they're like, I'm like, oh my god.
Right, like there's, and when the, what is it, shoulder? I can't remember, but like when it gets stuck, when it gets stuck, like you don't necessarily have some of those fears, but like again, everybody's different, and sometimes you'll tear more with breech. Luckily I didn't have that experience, but like my friend did have a little bit more of a tougher breech birth, you would say. But again, if you've got people that are trained and know exactly like how it's supposed to go and like the protocol, that it's like, okay, well, hey. And a lot of times, sometimes in home births, you won't even know. Like sometimes the moms will go in, they don't even know the baby's breech, and all of a sudden the midwives are surprised. They don't have time to get to a hospital, so they have to know what to do sometimes. And they have to be able to act fast and be like, okay, we're not touching it. It's a hands-off delivery, essentially. And you just kind of let your body
do its thing.
Yeah.
Whoa. Yeah. You're a brave woman. It's with my first, I wanted to do it super natural as possible. We live in an area where we have one of like the only, they call them baby friendly hospitals. So their protocol is it's like as natural as you can get without going to like a birthing center.
That's what my friend is doing. Yeah. She's like going to like a wing of the hospital that's like basically like a natural delivery wing, and it's super holistic. They have midwives on staff. They'll help you with yoga positions. They've got the balls. They do like trigger point while you're in labor. It's really, really amazing. So it's like, I'll do that because it's super low intervention if you want it to be. Right.
I had a really difficult birth. Like I was laboring for like 2 days, not really progressing. They thought it was going to be a C-section last minute, and finally I started to push.
Like, ready, let's go.
But he came out with a nuchal cord, so he had an APGAR of 0, so basically a stillbirth. They rushed him to a cart, had to take him to the NICU. They said, we don't know what's going to happen. They put him into hypothermic coma for 3 days. No one could touch him, and I didn't know if I was going to leave with a baby. So for me, it was almost as bad as a birth story could be.
Oh my God.
And they're telling me, thank God he was in the hospital, which I believe that. However, when she gave me the statistics of how many babies end up in NICU at the hospital, I had no idea how common it was. So she was telling me, at least at this hospital or maybe it was in general, it was 1 in 10 end up in NICU. And I'm like, that seems like a lot of babies.
Yeah.
And I know that birth has historically been kind of dangerous for mom and baby. And then we learned to wash our hands. That made a significant difference.